movie star Guillaume Depardieu has been granted Russian citizenship by President Putin. This dramatic move was reportedly sparked by the socialist French government's plan to introduce a 75% top income tax rate for those with annual earnings of over 1 million euros. Debates are raging across France about the impact of the event. So will it help to improve Russia's image? At the same time, a popular book written by a Chinese journalist about China's image is causing discussions in France. Why did Putin deliberately capture media attention by openly granting Russian citizenship to the French movie star?
Если Жерар действительно хочет иметь или вид на жительство в России, либо российский паспорт, то будем считать, что этот вопрос решен, и решен уже положительно.
Taxes appear to be at the heart of the matter. What does Russia's 13% income rate mean for a French actor facing a 75% rate in his home country? President François Hollande is accused of scorning the brilliant and the successful, while the media question Depardieu's patriotism.
Je trouve ça tout à fait déplacé.
Moi je le comprends assez. Il aurait pu rester français pour nous aider à payer nos impôts un petit peu, mais bon, qu'est-ce que vous voulez?
Depardieu's departure has triggered a hailstorm of public criticism for and against him. Does he represent the Gallic spirit? What are the core values of a French spirit? Depardieu says Russia is a great democracy. What is a real Russia, and why is Russian reputation not very popular in the West?
Правильной дорогой идешь, товарищ Депардье, и пускай вся Франция вернется назад.
Meanwhile, one best-selling book, Chinese People Are Common People in France, has caused a warm discussion about whether the image of China has been distorted by the French media. Welcome back to the studio discussion here. We are joined by Mr. Sergei Goncharov, specially invited professor at the East China Normal University, and Mr. Francisco Sischi, Italian columnist of Seoul 24 Hour. Later we'll also talk to Mr. Joseph Yanning, a senior European Policy Center expert in Germany. He's probably standing by in Brussels. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen.
Thank you.
What do you think of the impact of this departure by Mr. Guillaume Depardieu? Is he, a hero, a controversial actor, or someone who just escaped narrowly from a punitive tax?
Well, I think that this is a kind of interesting event. It's a kind of funny event, at least to
you sound a bit cynical.
To a certain extent. I think that we have here we have to look at several facets of this problem. First of all, it attracts the attention of European public opinion that this is really a flat 13% income tax in Russia for more than 10 years. I can tell you that working here, I have to pay 45% of the progressive Chinese income tax. And because of that, I envy a little bit my colleagues that in Moscow are paying 13%. So, from this point of view, I really can understand the reasons of Mr. Depardieu.
Do you know how many Chinese novel rich are immigrating to the United States or other countries where they could possibly escape from the income tax?
Mr. Yanzhu, IRS in the United States is also a very effective organization, and I think that maybe it's not the main reason for this. But the other part of the story is that I think that in practical terms, Mr. Depardieu cannot use this advantage for quite some time, because according to Russian legislation, he has to stay inside the country for 183 days in order to get the residential status and to enjoy this 13% tax.
And simply a bear hug from President Putin doesn't guarantee his future in Russia.
Well,
is that what you're saying?
Mr. Putin has guaranteed to him a passport, citizenship. But according to the Russian law, there is no exceptions. You can become a taxation resident only after staying constantly in the country for 183 days. And because of that, he will spend this time. Because of that, I think that after returning from Russia, maybe it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, to the ceremony of inauguration of the best footballer of the year in Zurich. Mr. Depardieu has told that actually he is not ceasing to become a French, and he probably also will continue to aspire for Belgian citizenship as well.
You mean basically you don't trust this guy who was jailed for driving a mad car and who joined the celebration of a controversial nationalist from Chechnya?
Well, I think that, he's a great actor, by the way. He's a great...
That means a lot. That itself means a lot.
That, we can judge this person by the ordinary yardstick. And I think that those people who don't like Mr. Putin, and because of that they say that he is, the second-rate performer, and he is fat, and he is alcoholic, and everything, it's not right.
Excuse me, Cici.
Yes.
Do you think this is a very successful PR campaign from the perspective of the Russian government? Because, the image of Russia is not very popular for a majority of the European neighbors.
Yes, all of a sudden, Russia managed to prove two things. That is no longer communist because they just have a 13% taxes, and that France and Europeans are more communist than Russia because they have a 75% taxes. So this puts things in a very different perspective, very interesting. And as you know, media and television sometimes is made more of these effective little moves that communicate or can communicate a different perception of reality. After that, maybe some people in Europe will look at Russia and at their own country in a different light. And at the end of the day, that may all be that matters.
Let me cross over to Mr. Joseph Yanning, Director of Studies with the European Policy Center in Brussels. Hello.
How are you?
Hi. Happy New Year.
Yeah, same to you.
Do you think this is more of a fun or a news value for you when you first came across with this new story about the dramatic move of Mr. Guillaume Depardieu giving up his French citizenship, which was so much cherished by his nationals back in France? Do you think this is too dramatic to be acceptable?
Well, I believe it will rather be the exception among the French rich than the rule. After all, Depardieu is a colorful character, and he may have felt forced into more radical steps because he also has some other problems with the French legal system due to his driving habits. But it seems to me that while the luxury tax is a risky endeavor of the French government as such, it is rather unlikely that now Western Europe's rich people will be attracted to Russia with its rather questionable record of the rule of law.
Let me ask you one follow-up question, Joe. France is at the same time basically a Catholic culture, which means the nation, a majority of the people remain suspicious of money and hostile to the wealthy. Is that part of the reasons for Mr. Depardieu to have left for Russia?
Well, the French face a similar problem than many other European countries. They are under a severe burden, and in these times, the bigger or stronger shoulders should carry a larger burden. That's the rationale for a differentiated or proportional tax system that exists throughout most countries of Europe, particularly in the old welfare states of Western Europe. Now, the question is, how high can that extra burden be without creating an extra sense of injustice and inequality? In some countries, like in Germany, the Constitutional Court has established that if you give half of your income, that's about how much the state should or could justifiably take from you. If that exceeds well beyond that threshold, you either have to appeal to patriotism in a very distinct way, or you will face longer-term troubles, and that's what France is now going to. Solidarity should not be overstretched because then people simply opt out of it, and it's always those people that can afford to opt out.
Thank you very much. We have to leave you there and go back to you in the second half of the program, but thank you for joining us, Joe. Welcome back. Sergey, what do you think of the issue of patriotism? Surprisingly, Local media responses were quite mixed so far, to my knowledge, with Libération, one influential newspaper in France, saying this guy should be accused of betraying his motherland, because the sense of being a French should be something that is the envy of a majority of not only the French nationals, but many who love French culture. Now, at the same time, Le Figaro, yet another popular and conservative newspaper, stopped short of passing any moral judgment about his departure, Mr. Depardieu's departure for Russia. What do you think of the social divide?
Well, I think that actually here, as I understand, the paying taxes is treated like a kind of social obligation in France. This is a part of the civic culture. You have to bear this burden. And because of that, in some quarters of the Chinese public opinion, there is a strong discontent with what Mr. Depardieu has done. And this is understandable. At the same time, France is a democratic country, and Mr. Hollande was elected president not unanimously, not 100% of people has voted for him. So because of that, there is a substantial amount of people who also disagree with his taxation policy.
Well,
these
the
people
French
probably support Mr. Depardieu's decision.
The French Constitutional Court struck down the ruling, administrative ruling, by saying this punishing tax rate is by nature discriminatory against the rich, the successful, and the talented people. Do you think this move is ideologically motivated?
I think it is very practical, because in this world, if you have a lot of money and you have punishing tariffs, and if it's 75% of direct taxes, it could end up being almost 90%, because then you add the VAT, the tariffs, the local taxes, etc., then you end up giving to the states 90% of your income. And in this world, unless you have a very strong ideological motivation, which can last only for a very limited period of time, now French is in difficulty, please help us, otherwise people with money will move out of a country because they will be forced.
In fact, he's not the only tax exile.
Exactly. You forcing these high, very extremely high tax tariffs, force people with money to move out of the country. And in the end, what you have is you have in the country only people with little money who have little money to pay taxes with, to start with. So it is very difficult situation. A country in difficulty has to think other ways than just taxing the rich. This hasn't worked in the past and will work not now either.
President Hollande has a very strong socialist background. It means very much as what he says during the presidential campaign, that he dislikes immensely the rich. Now, the Hate Rich campaign, do you think it has delivered a very negative impact upon some of those who believe the harder you work, the more you earn?
Well, I think that Mr. Depardieu has given some interview or written a letter in which there is a very interesting fact. Among 50 persons who are considered to be the most eminent citizens in France, something like 20 or 30 are living abroad. We can name such such performances, for example, Alain Delon and others, who are staying in Switzerland for a long time. Probably these recent moves will give more impetus for the rich people to move out to some other places. Not necessarily to Russia, but yeah.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Sergei Goncharov and Mr. Francisco Sishu. We have also been talking to Mr. Joseph Yanning, Director of Studies with the European Policy Center. We're discussing implications and repercussions of the recent departure of Mr. Depardieu, a French movie star. He's left for Russia, where he was granted a Russian citizenship by President Putin. We'll be back in a few minutes. Why did Putin deliberately capture media attention by openly granting Russian citizenship to the French movie star?
Если Жерар действительно хочет иметь или вид на жительство в России, либо российский паспорт, то будем считать, что этот вопрос решен, и решен уже положительно.
Taxes appear to be at the heart of the matter. What does Russia's 13% income rate mean for a French actor facing a 75% rate in his home country? President François Hollande is accused of scorning the brilliant and the successful, while the media question Depardieu's patriotism.
Je trouve ça tout à fait déplacé.
Moi, je le comprends assez.
Il aurait pu rester français pour nous aider à payer nos impôts un petit peu, mais bon, qu'est-ce que vous voulez?
Depardieu's departure has triggered a hailstorm of public criticism for and against him. Does he represent the Gallic spirit? What are the core values of a French spirit? Depardieu says Russia is a great democracy. What is a real Russia, and why is Russian reputation not very popular in the West?
Правильной дорогой идешь, товарищ Депардье. И пускай вся Франция вернется назад.
Meanwhile, one best-selling book, Chinese People Are Common People in France, has caused a warm discussion about whether the image of China has been distorted by the French media. Welcome back, gentlemen. The image of Russia. That has caused a wide discussion, not only among Russians, but French. This guy, Mr. Depardieu, says that he loves Russia for its history, society, culture, and he says Russia is a great democracy. This is a little bit controversial for the rest of the European countries here. Xixi.
Well, it is interesting because to me what he proves is the crisis in Europe, the crisis that goes beyond the economic crisis. A crisis of values, a crisis of system, a crisis, again, of our democratic system where people feel that they are ill represented by their own elected leaders. It is interesting. Is it right? Is it wrong? I don't know. This is a different issue, but at least it opens an issue for discussion, and it casts a new light also on Russia, which is also very interesting in this moment of transition. Maybe what is even more important than what is Russian right or wrong is the depth of the moral and ethical crisis in Europe. Why are we going through all this? Are we all allegiances to France, our country, or to European Union, which is the one system that tells us all what to do and what not to do? This is very confusing for all Europeans, I would say.
Sergei, what Mr. Depardieu says is perhaps interpreted this way. He is more disillusioned with the declining capitalism in Europe than, something he loves. For example, Russia is a democracy, which remains a point of controversy for the rest of the European politicians and the media industry. What do you think?
Well, I think that actually the situation with Mr. Depardieu has fallen. The public opinion in Russia itself is very much divided on on the situation with Mr. Depardieu. There is a political opposition in Russia, and they were trying to denigrate this event by saying a lot of not very good words about Mr. Depardieu, which I think it's not right. He is a great actor, and he has to be praised very highly from this respect. At the same time, there were a lot of controversial events in political situation in Russia, such like this trial of Pussy Riot band and this controversial law on banning the adoption of orphans by the Americans. That also has created a lot of negative reaction in the society. Because of that, from the point of view of administration of Mr. Putin, some positive events were needed. And maybe by the administration it was treated like one of the events like this gaining of the citizenship by Mr. Depardieu. I think that actually it is a positive event because for a positive event in a way that it attracted attention that not everything is bad in Russia, that actually the well-being of the people has grown, and there is a certain degree of economic and political stability in the country.
Thank you very much. We now turn to Mr. Joseph Yanning for his comment on the image of Russia after Mr. Putin won re-election in the campaign. Hello.
Hello.
Well,
I think, yeah, sorry.
After he took the Kremlin following the controversial campaign success, so to speak, the White House was very reluctant to send a message of congratulations to President Putin. If you look at how an amendment to the Jackson-Van Nick law was passed by the U.S. Congress, and then it was followed by a retaliatory measure forbidding or preventing Americans from adopting Russian children. Now, this kind of a game has impressed the world about the ongoing rivalry between the U.S. and Russia. Do you think this recent dramatic event of Mr. Depardieu has been used by President Putin to improve his image and to reinforce his PR campaign against a deliberate attempt by the U.S., quote-unquote, to demonize Russia?
That may very well be the case. It was an easy offer, and Putin could do a friend a favor that would create some attention. Although I have to say, from observing it from outside France in Western Europe, the level of attention is not very high. So if it is a PR campaign directed at Western Europe, the impact of this is a rather limited one. On the other hand, in Europe or within the EU, the re-election of Putin had been expected and has been met with some hesitance, but not with the same kind of criticism that we have seen in the United States. For the Europeans, the more important question is when and how will Russia, with Putin re-elected to another term as president, come out of this mostly negative attitude of seeing the world as being hostile to Russia, as being ganged up against Russia, and Russia being forced to hold up against it. So the Europeans ask themselves, when will Russia come up with a sort of a positive agenda in its external relations, particularly with Europe?
Thank you very much for your participation. Welcome back. Let's look at one recently released book by a Chinese journalist. It's about the image of China. Well, both Russia and China have been described by Western media as autocracy as opposed to democracy. Now, the Chinese and the Russians both argue that there should not be a universal standard to judge if the form of governance in Russia and China should live up to the expectations of the Westerners, who are known for their West-centric standards in judging everything. What do you think of, say, this book, which says basically we are human, we are common people, very much like the French people. We hate, we love, we dislike, we have our own feelings about our own country, culture, form of governance instead of democracy all the time, human rights, so on and so forth.
Well, unfortunately, I cannot read French, but I have read some articles by Mr. Zheng Zhulin in Chinese in the internet. And because of that, I have some idea about the contents of what he is writing. I think that he has done a wonderful job. First of all, I think that he is the first Chinese author who has written this book directly in French. And because of his background, because his father also was a great specialist in French literature, he has done a wonderful job, as I understand, to do it in good French.
Oh, by the way, Mr. Depardieu's father is a communist.
Oh,
he was also a communist as a young man.
Yeah.
Depardieu was a young communist. People change their mind.
Yeah.
Well, like Mitt Romney, right?
Yeah.
Very changeable.
Okay. And I think that this is a kind of example of a very positive attitude to changing the perception of the country. As I understand, he is not trying to criticize his colleagues, but he is trying to explain what is the real life in the modern China, with all its complications, that it is not one-dimensional, but many-dimensional, and that actually, when the more deeply you understand it, the less place for misperceptions there are. I think that we have to study in Russia from his example how to explain your country in a positive way to your friends abroad.
Well, since you've been staying here for a long while, and you have many complaints about how foreign correspondents have been treated here when it comes to how the image of China has been perceived outside this country and inside increasingly. I'm not talking about the recent suspension of the visa for the former bureau chief of New York Times here. That's a very controversial issue. But let me ask you one question. When half of the French correspondents here based in China cannot speak Chinese, can they give a very accurate perception and the coverage about what is going on in this country, a very dynamic and complicated culture?
Well, you may argue that they cannot, but on the other hand, language is not the only instrument of understanding a country. And sometimes knowing a language can be a disadvantage because you think that you know the country, but then you misunderstand a lot of things. So language is a tricky issue, although it's very useful. But I would say I would like to go back to the issue of misunderstanding Russia and China, because I think with China there is also another important issue. With Russia, the real difference is between systems. You have a different system from ours, but at the end of the day, we are all Europeans. China, there is the issue of civilization. Very different culture, very different for many centuries. This is a difference that goes beyond the system. In fact, there is prejudice against Chinese, both coming from mainland China or from Taiwan or Hong Kong, which have similar political systems to the ones in Europe. So I think the difference of perception, the difference of accepting China in the Western world has also to do with culture and history.
Thank you very much. Despite the fact that China is and has been examined with the ideological lens, the resilience of the ruling party of CPC and the governance of the country may have been underestimated by the outside observers. But that's the topic for the next round of a dialogue discussion here. We welcome your participation. Until next time, bye for now. €1 million. Debates are raging across France about the impact of the event. So will it help to improve Russia's image? At the same time, a popular book written by a Chinese journalist about China's image is causing discussions in France. Why did Putin deliberately capture media attention by openly granting Russian citizenship to the French movie star?
Если Жерар действительно хочет иметь или вид на жительство в России, или...
Chinese people are common people in France has caused a warm discussion about whether the image of China has been distorted by the French media. Welcome back to the studio discussion here. We are joined by Mr. Sergei Goncharov, specially invited professor at the East China Normal University, and Mr. Francisco Sischi, Italian columnist of Seoul 24 Hour. Later we'll also talk to Mr. Joseph Yanning, a senior European Policy Center expert in Germany. He's probably standing by in Brussels.
Российский паспорт, то будем считать, что этот вопрос решен.
Taxes appear to be at the heart of the matter. What does Russia's 13% income rate mean for a French actor facing a 75% rate in his home country? President François Hollande is accused of scorning the brilliant and the successful, while the media question Depardieu's patriotism.
Je trouve ça tout à fait déplacé.
Moi, je ne comprends pas assez.
Movie star Guillaume Depardieu has been granted Russian citizenship by President Putin. This dramatic move was reportedly sparked by the socialist French government's plan to introduce a 75% top income tax rate for those with annual earnings of over...
C'est français pour nous aider à payer nos impôts un petit peu, mais bon, qu'est-ce que vous voulez?
Depardieu's departure has triggered a hailstorm of public criticism for and against him. Does he represent the Gallic spirit? What are the core values of a French spirit? Depardieu says Russia is a great democracy. What is a real Russia and why is Russian reputation not very popular in the West?
Правильной дорогой идешь, товарищ Депардье, и пускай вся Франция вернется назад.
Meanwhile, one best-selling book